The wind cut across the clearing like a razor, chilling the body of the lumberjack before the sky could darken beyond twilight. He stood at the edge of the dense pine forest, calling himself Jonah's Blaze, though few souls remained to speak it. Years back, he had christened himself with the name after the rope that bound him when he was nearly lynched for a crime he did not commit. Since then, he had left behind towns, farms, and prying neighbors. This clearing where he felled trees and fed off the land was his only home. That evening, Jonas had finished stacking the logs he'd felled that day. His axe lay in the shed, its handle smooth from his grip but splintered at the head. He took in a breath, tasted wood smoke, saw the last whispers of gold in the sky. Then he heard faint crying. Alone in the woods, crying meant someone was lost or in trouble. He gripped his coat tighter and followed the sound across fields of mud and pine needles. The forest swallowed his footsteps until he came upon a wagon parked under a low-branched oak. Lantern light dangled from its side, casting a tarnished amber glow. A man slouched near the barrel wheels, black mud clung to his boots. He wore dusty trousers and a dirty linen shirt. On the wagon seat, hunched against a stitched blanket, was a girl, not more than 16, pale in the lamplight and swollen in her belly. She shifted her weight slowly, eyes clouded with fear but burning with defiance. Jonas's heart, long sheltered, stirred, not pity, not yet. There was suspicion first. His time had taught him that humans were complex, unforgiving. He took a slow step forward. The girl's father looked up, his eyes empty. He lifelessly held the reins, as though the horses had also died. Jonas found himself within arm's length before he recognized the boarded windows and pocked siding of the wagon, the mark of traveling folks. But even among drifters, this was a hard sight. The father spoke, voice flat with finality. "She's yours now." Jonas inclined his head. The father's meaning was clear. Some ancient misdeal of debts or debts of conscience had driven him to this. He scanned the land, seeking signs of pursuit. None. He sensed the man was done. Jonas stepped closer. "Get out," the man spat at the girl. "Go on with him." He nodded toward Jonas. She did not move. Her eyes lingered on Jonas, weighing whether this 4-year stranger meant help or cruelty. She would discover soon enough. He turned to the father. "You going to walk away?" The man looked up once more at Jonas. "I sold her," he said. No defense in the words. Got nothing else left to lose. Jonas felt a pulse in his throat. "Name." The father shrugged. "Tom Flynn." He pushed himself to his feet, leaned on the wagon. "She's Mary, $50. Jonas heard enough. His throat tightened with something heavy. He shook his head. "That ain't business I want." Tom tensed but did not argue. He pulled down the blanket and jerked the girl, almost roughly, to her feet. She stumbled but caught herself, placing a hand on her swollen belly. She considered running but then turned to Jonas. Voice barely a whisper, she said, "Will he hurt me?" Jonas thought of the man's hollow eyes, the empty stare of a soul broken by too many lies. "I don't reckon he'll care what happens to you now." Mary's eyes darted between Jonas and the road. Jonas met her gaze. "Come with me. I got a cabin. You'll be safe there." She glanced at Tom. He met her stare, said, "He's right." She hesitated, fear and instinct locked in her veins. Then she nodded once. They began. Jonas guided Mary down a rough pine needle pathway. Tom climbed back into his wagon, flicked the reins, and without a backward glance lurched away in the dark. Jonas watched until the creak of wheel and mule hoof faded. Then he turned to Mary. She sat on a fallen log. Her hips clearly painful, sweat beading on her brow though the air was cold. She stared at the wood forest beyond. "I'll break your arms if you try to throw me off," she said with trembling defiance. Jonas managed a ghost of a grin. He had expected something fierce, something broken without hope. She was fiercer than he'd guessed. "I'd like to see you try," he answered. They set out again, deeper into the pine, until they came to his cabin, a squat, single-room structure with battered shutters and a lean-to for firewood. He offered Mary the lean-to, the bed was his alone. He chopped fresh wood and built a fire. The cabin glowed against the cold night. Mary lingered by the doorway, still unsure if the flicker in the dark was danger or sanctuary. Jonas brought her tea he brewed from bark he'd dried months ago. She sipped, benumbed, and watched him as he forked wood into the stove. The air smelled of pine smoke, soot, hot iron. The cabin was small enough that she could feel every breath he took. He kept his eyes averted, to say nothing of kindness. If her father's instinct had been to sell her, maybe the world thought she had no right to mercy. "Why help?" she finally asked. He turned slowly and faced her. In all the years since his rope-marked days, no one had asked him why he still lived this way. His answer came low and rough. "Because once I watched someone suffer and nothing stopped it. I ain't letting it happen again." She studied him, then she turned, moved toward the fire, and closed the last sliver of daylight behind her. Night soared outside. In that simple cabin, a pregnant girl and a lonely lumberjack were bound by circumstance. But in the tremble of that night's breath, something more fragile took root, the promise of salvation on both sides. Mary bled in her sleep the first night. Jonas heard her moan low and caught the sound before it turned to a scream. He crossed the cabin in 2 steps. The blanket beneath her was soaked dark in a way no firelight could disguise. She clutched her belly with fingers clawed from fear. "Don't touch me," she rasped, but her voice cracked and her eyes begged otherwise. Jonas didn't flinch. He rolled back the quilt she'd twisted around herself and saw the blood, not yet gushing, but more than should be. "The baby's early," he said, mostly to himself. "I ain't ready," she whispered. Her breath came fast now, jagged. "He's supposed to come in the spring." Jonas pulled on his coat and grabbed the old tin basin he used to wash. "You're in labor. Or trouble, we'll find out soon." She moaned again, her legs shifted, stiff with pain. Jonas knelt beside her and reached under the bunk where he kept clean rags wrapped in canvas. He laid them beside her as she turned her face into the wall and shook. The smell of blood thickened. Hours passed. The girl screamed once, bit her fist the second time. Jonas stayed near but did not touch unless she asked him to. When she did, her hand clutched his like a drowning branch. Morning found them with no baby, no change in the bleeding, only the groan of a girl with fire under her skin. Jonas knew he couldn't deliver this child alone. He thought of the road east, where the widow Havers lived 2 hills over. She had birthed 4 and buried 3, she would know. "I'll go get help," he said, standing. "You don't move, you don't sleep. Keep talking if you feel yourself slipping." Mary nodded, eyes bright with fever. "Don't leave me too long." He paused at the door. "I won't." He took the trail fast, old boots slapping dirt and root. Clouds threatened but held. He reached Widow Havers by noon. Her eyes, sharp beneath her bonnet, widened when she heard the tale. "Girl sold off by her own pa," she muttered. "Hell's mercy." She grabbed her satchel and told her boy to keep the fire going. Together they rode back, the widow's mule barely fast enough for Jonas's urgency. When they returned, Mary was curled on the floor, the bedding kicked off, and her lips whispering something lost. The widow acted quick, forced water into her, pressed herbs to her mouth. Hours passed in grunts and silence. Then at dusk, the cabin filled with a new sound, a single wet wail. Jonas, blood streaked up to his wrists, watched as the widow lifted a pale baby boy into the light. His skin was purple, but his breath came. Mary reached out weakly, face slack with exhaustion. She held the child like she had waited lifetimes. "I'll name him Elijah," she murmured, "for what I lost." The widow washed him and handed him over. "You lost more than most," she said gently. That night, while Mary slept with Elijah tucked into the crook of her arm, Jonas sat outside under the stars. He thought the girl would die. He thought himself unable to save a thing, but both were still breathing. That counted for something. The snow came 2 days later, not soft but sudden, like the land had given up pretending. They were snowed in for 3 weeks. In that time, Jonas rebuilt the chimney, split the firewood twice, and slept in the linta with a buffalo hide for warmth. Mary nursed Elijah and mended Jonas's torn shirt with quiet determination. She didn't speak of her father. She didn't speak of the man who had made the child, but the rage flickered behind her eyes. It wasn't weak or broken. It had hardened into something sharp. One morning she asked, "Can I learn the axe?" Jonas looked up from the carving he was doing on the porch. "What for?" She rubbed her thumb against the hilt of a kitchen knife. "I want to know how to take down something tall, something that don't fall easy." He didn't answer, just handed her his smaller hatchet and pointed to a fallen trunk near the creek. She limped toward it, body still healing. But she swung and the blade sang against bark. Over the days that followed, she grew stronger, learned the grain of wood and the feel of a steady grip. She never missed when she swung. Elijah grew in quiet spurts, his cries short and furious, his eyes watching Mary as if he already knew she was not like other mothers. She held him close while learning to chop, to trap, to shoot. Jonas taught her all he knew, but she moved beyond it, driven by something deeper. One night as spring broke, she said, "He'll come back. Maybe not my father, but someone like him. Men like that don't vanish. They sell and steal again. I need to be ready." Jonas didn't argue. He'd seen too much truth in that to speak against it. Mary sharpened her blade by firelight. Elijah slept on a blanket by the stove. Jonas carved another figure, a small elk this time, and set it on the shelf above the hearth. Out there, beyond the pine, the world still burned the helpless. But in that cabin, a new kind of fire was building, a girl-turned mother who had bled and survived, and the lumberjack who had offered her more than a roof. A place, a skill, a weapon. By the second spring, Mary no longer asked for permission. She took the rifle into the woods at dawn, Elijah wrapped to her back, and came home at dusk with rabbits slung over her shoulder or a brace of birds bleeding into the snow melt. Jonas stopped asking where she'd gone. He saw it in her walk, in the tautness of her jaw and the way she cleaned her kill without flinching. The girl was gone. What remained was something older than her years and angrier. She still spoke little. The words she did use were simple, direct, often barbed. Jonas accepted them without judgment. He had been a silent man, too, once. He understood how pain could coil into silence like a fist held too long. One night, while the wind beat the shutters and Elijah dozed with a fever, Mary knelt by the hearth and said, "I remember where he took me first." Jonas did not look up from the trap he was fixing. "The man who made the child." She nodded slowly. A rail house in Darwin County, red shutters, they kept girls upstairs. Jonas waited. He said he'd bought me a future, that my body was the payment. He said if I cried, I'd make it worse. Jonas's hands stilled. He didn't ask more, didn't need to. The words came like poison spat slow. "He died," she said, "later, after the baby started growing." "How?" She didn't speak for a long time. Then, with a rock to the face, she lifted the log hook and stoked the fire. Her eyes stayed locked on the flames. But the man who paid him, the one who owned the rail house, he's still breathing, still selling girls. Jonas said nothing. The fire cracked and hissed between them. Elijah coughed once in his sleep, then settled. Mary stood and pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders. "I'm going back there. Someday, I'll burn that house to the floor." Jonas didn't argue. He'd seen what happened when people turned away from what needed doing. He'd done it once himself, and it had left a mark deeper than any blade. He looked into the fire and saw the shape of a plan begin to form, jagged and slow, like roots in frost-bitten soil. The next morning he showed Mary the map he'd kept folded in a tin box under the floorboards. It was old, from a time when he still wandered. Rail lines, river routes, townships gone quiet. She pointed to a curve near the southern edge. "That's the county." He nodded. "4 days' ride if we go light." Mary's eyes sharpened. "Then we go before the boy's too old to remember what we're fighting for." In the months that followed, she trained harder. She learned how to climb without sound, how to shoot with gloves on, how to trap not just beasts but men. Jonas taught her everything except pity. That was a lesson she had no interest in learning. When Elijah turned 2, they left. They didn't take the road. They moved through gulches and broken timberland, down deer paths and creek beds. Mary carried Elijah in a sling when he tired and fed him wild plums and boiled greens. Jonas carried the rifle and watched her back. They reached the edge of Darwin County under moonlight. The trees thinned and the smell of coal fires hung low. They camped on the ridge and looked down at the town. A rail line split it like a scar. And there, near the station, stood the house with red shutters. Jonas spoke first. "You sure?" Mary didn't blink. "I remember the sound of the upstairs door, how it didn't latch all the way." They moved in silence after that, scouting, watching. The house had new girls now, new men too, but the overseer was the same, a thick-bellied man with a face like spoiled fat. He stood on the porch at dusk, smoked a pipe, laughed too loud. Mary watched him for 3 days. She mapped his habits, his blind spots, the back stairs where no one stood guard. Then, on the 4th night, she left Elijah with Jonas and walked into town with a scarf around her head and a limp she didn't have to fake. She knocked on the door of the red shutter house. A young man answered. She asked for work. He looked her over, smirked, and led her inside. Jonas waited on the ridge with Elijah sleeping in a hollow beside him. He did not pray. But he watched the house until dawn. At sunrise, the fire started. Smoke curled first from the eaves, then the roof. Shouts echoed, windows shattered. People spilled out, coughing, screaming. Mary did not come out with them. Jonas stood. He shifted Elijah onto his back and moved down the hill. He found her behind the house, face smeared with soot, one hand clutching a pistol with the hammer back. Her dress was torn, but she stood upright, blood on her cheek and a look in her eyes that chilled even Jonas. "I locked him in," she said. Jonas didn't ask who, he only nodded. She turned to Elijah, reached for him. He stirred in his sleep but did not wake. She held him close, then looked back at the burning house. "No girl's going to wake in that place again." They left town before the sun cleared the ridge. By midday they were deep in the trees again, wind at their backs, smoke far behind. The world didn't know what they'd done, didn't care. But justice had come, quiet and cruel. And Mary had found something colder than survival. She had found vengeance, and she had survived it. The woods welcomed them back like a grave opens for the dead, silently and without resistance. By the time they returned to the cabin, the mountain ash had turned red, the creek low and bitter with rot. Autumn pressed down early that year. They had left justice burning in Darwin County, but peace did not ride with them. Mary slept little. Elijah, now restless at night, picked up on her unease. He cried when wind knocked the shutters, whimpered when coyotes howled too close. Mary kept a blade by her pillow and the rifle loaded beneath the floorboards. Jonas said nothing, but he watched. He watched as she walked the perimeter each morning, checked snares, scanned for bootprints that weren't theirs. There was no word from the south. No posse, no sheriffs, no riders. The house had been one of many in that county, but something had shifted in Mary. Vengeance had not cured her. It had only shown her how wide the sickness spread. She began carving marks into the trees, not words, symbols. Small slashes and circles deep enough to last. Jonas asked once what they meant. She said, "Places I'll come back to, things not yet done." Winter came early and hard. Snow buried the trail by mid-November. Jonas hunted less, taught Elijah how to set lines for hair instead. Mary built a second room onto the cabin with her own hands, a narrow bunk space separate from Elijah's cradle and the hearth. She worked through blizzards, numb fingers swinging the hammer, breath clouding in front of her like a dying spirit. Jonas watched her climb the roof one morning with frost at her heels. She moved like a soldier, like someone who'd seen too much to ever sit still. He knew that rest was not in her nature. He knew, too, that the child, Elijah, was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. One night the wind howled so loud it seemed to drag voices with it, shouts, a scream, the iron slam of a cell door. Mary rose from her cot, clutching her knife, eyes wild. Elijah stirred. Jonas stepped between them. "Only wind," he said, but Mary looked past him. "Not for me." She opened the door, let the cold slap her across the face, and stared into the night until her breath slowed. She didn't return to bed. She sat in the snow, silent until dawn. By spring, she had built herself a ledger, not of numbers or trade, but names, places, rumors. Jonas brought her whispers from trappers. She wrote them down. She learned of other counties where girls went missing, brothels hidden in basements, boys groomed to bait them in. She spoke to no one except Elijah and Jonas, but her eyes gathered the world in handfuls. Jonas knew the look. He'd seen it once in a mirror, back before he found his name in the gallows and had to carve it out again with axe and exile. Mary was making herself into something larger than a mother, larger than a survivor. She was becoming a reckoning. That summer a man came up the ridge. He wore a black coat, fine boots, carried a satchel with papers, claimed he was from the district office, said he was looking for a girl named Mary Flynn, claimed she was connected to a fire in Darwin. Asked polite questions, smiled too much. Mary didn't hide. She stood on the porch with her rifle cradled, Elijah playing in the dirt at her feet. She listened to him talk, watched his fingers, the twitch in his jaw when he lied. When he said her name again, she raised the rifle. Jonas stepped behind her, silent as shadow. "You need to leave now," she said. "Next time, come honest, or don't come at all." The man's smile faded. He looked from her to Jonas, then back to Elijah. A flicker of disgust crossed his face. Jonas saw it, and something old and heavy settled in his chest. The man left without another word. That night they dug a trench around the cabin, reinforced the shutters, laid fresh traps with bone hooks. Jonas didn't ask her if she meant to run again. He knew the answer. They weren't running, they were waiting. Elijah, now nearly 3, had learned silence. He shadowed Mary's movements like a cub to its mother. When he cried, it was sharp and brief. When he laughed, it sounded like it didn't belong in this world, but he clung to her with small, strong hands and watched everything. Jonas carved him a toy rifle. Elijah slept with it under his blanket. By late summer, a second man came. This one wore no badge. His knuckles were scarred, his boots stained. He carried nothing, said less. He didn't ask for Mary. Just watched the house from the tree line until Jonas met him there. No words were exchanged, only a glance and the slow reach of Jonas's hand toward the knife at his belt. The man turned, vanished into the woods. Mary didn't ask what happened, but she packed a satchel that night. She took only essentials, salt, dried meat, flint, a folded list. Jonas asked where she was headed. "Everywhere this happens," she said. He didn't stop her. He gave her a second blade and told her the creeks to follow. She kissed Elijah while he slept, hands lingering a moment longer than needed. At dawn, she was gone. Elijah woke, looked for her, and did not cry. Jonas stood at the porch, watching the road that led nowhere. The girl he'd taken in was gone now. What walked beyond the trees was something else. A storm shaped like a woman, with fire in her wake and blood under her fingernails. He didn't mourn her departure, he respected it. Mary traveled under false names. Sometimes she was a widow looking for work, sometimes a healer passing through, sometimes just a ghost with calloused hands and an empty smile. She moved through counties where girls vanished in daylight, where lawmen drank beside traffickers, where brothels hid behind feed stores. She followed whispers, and where the whispers grew loud, she stayed. She carried no mercy, only resolve. And a list, each name was marked with a cross once dealt with. Some burned, some bled. Some simply vanished, their bodies swallowed by earth or river, left to be forgotten like the girls they'd sold. Mary kept moving. The more she did, the clearer her purpose became. In Claybridge, she exposed a judge who brokered orphans like cattle. In Midrow, she burned the barn where a preacher kept girls chained under straw. She did not shout. She did not leave warnings. She moved with the quiet of rot and left behind silence where monsters once stood, and word began to spread, not just of the deeds, but of the woman behind them. Some called her a spirit, others a vengeance-born harlot. Men who knew her name spoke it in hushed tones, and girls, young, ruined, forgotten girls, began whispering of the fire-eyed woman with a knife that never missed. Mary left no trail. She walked through places as though already dead. Back at the cabin, Jonas raised Elijah in the quiet her absence left. The boy was wild in the woods but careful with traps. He learned to sharpen tools, to fish with thread, to wait in silence for game to pass. He asked about his mother often. Jonas told him truth, but little of it. She's out where wrong things are. Is she fighting them? Jonas nodded. Yes. She is. Elijah stared into the fire then, as if it held her shadow. He turned 5 without her. That winter he built his first snare. The next spring he asked for his own knife. Jonas gave him a blade too dull to harm, but Elijah slept with it under his cot regardless. Then, in the 6th year since Mary had left, she returned. No warning, no letter. Just a figure in the trees one dusk, hood drawn low, clothes road-stained. She walked into the yard without slowing, eyes locked on the cabin. Elijah was chopping wood. He turned, squinted, dropped the axe. He didn't say a word. He walked to her like he'd never stopped knowing her scent, and she knelt, arms wide. He crashed into her chest like a stone cast down a well. Jonas stepped from the porch, mouth tight. You bleeding. Mary looked up, smiled dry. Not yet. He nodded once. Good. That night they sat together for the first time in years. Mary had new lines on her face, not from age but from fire, scars along her forearm, a thin cut across her jawline that had not healed right. She didn't flinch when Elijah traced it with small fingers. They call me the Bone Widow now, she said, voice barely above the crackle of the fire, even though I never married. Jonas stirred the coals. You come home for good. Mary shook her head. Just to rest, for a while, there's more to be done, but I wanted him to know my face before I go again. Elijah listened without blinking. Can I come next time? Mary looked at him then, really looked. Saw the boy had her fire, her stance, her sharpness. Not yet, she said, but someday, he asked. She paused. Someday. That summer they lived in a rhythm. Elijah followed Mary on long walks, learned new paths, new plants. She taught him which trees bled when cut, which ones whispered when you leaned against their bark. Jonas watched, quieter than usual. The boy was learning too fast. Mary knew it too. She told Jonas one night, after Elijah had gone to sleep, he's stronger than I was at that age. You'll leave again, Jonas said. Mary nodded. He'll want to follow me someday. But he'll need to know what I'm chasing first. You think you'll find the end of it? No, she said, but I can shorten the list for him. Jonas threw a log on the fire. You ever think of stopping? She looked out the window, where the woods folded into dark. Stopping what they want women like me to do. That's how they win. Jonas didn't argue. He saw now what he had helped raise, not a daughter, not even a mother, but a blade. Sharpened by pain, honed by fury, wielded by choice. In late autumn, Mary packed her bag again. Elijah stood by the door, arms crossed. You won't be back for a long time. She crouched before him, hands on his shoulders. When I come back, you'll be old enough to ask me the names. He didn't smile. He nodded. Jonas stood on the porch, watching the light die behind the ridge. Mary adjusted her satchel, turned once, then vanished down the trail like smoke in dusk wind. The world would remember what it had done to her. That much was certain. Years passed like falling needles, slow, steady, unnoticed until the ground was covered. Elijah grew tall in silence. The boy who once slept with a dull knife now moved like his mother through the woods, barefoot even in frost, unstartled by blood. He hunted on his own by 10, tracked without error by 12. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice had an edge. The forest had raised him, but the fire had shaped him. Jonas aged in a different way. His beard turned white, his hands slower on the axe. He built a bench outside the cabin and spent more time sitting than carving. But he kept the rifle clean, the trap set, the trail to the river cleared. Elijah watched him and understood. Strength wasn't loud, it was loyal. Mary returned once more just after Elijah's 15th birthday. She didn't knock. Jonas looked up from the bench, squinted through the mist. She walked out of the trees carrying a man's severed hand in a leather sack. Didn't explain, didn't need to. Jonas pointed to the firewood pile, stacks low. She grinned, still bossing me around. He shook his head. Never could. That night around the fire, she told them only what they needed to know. One man ran a mine where girls were worked to bone. Another kept papers that gave names, buyers, sums. She had destroyed both, set flames in the tunnels. Buried the ledgers in a field so salted it would never bear root. Elijah's ready, she said, staring across the flames at Jonas. Jonas didn't answer. His gaze went to the boy, who met it and did not look away. I taught him all I could, the old man said. The rest is yours. Mary rose and walked to her son. She stood over him for a moment, then knelt. From her coat she pulled the first knife she ever carried, nicked, dark-stained, wrapped in rawhide. She placed it in his hand. Do you know what it's for? Elijah nodded, to cut truth from rot. Jonas blinked at that. He'd never heard her speak those words. They'd been born in the boy on his own. Mary embraced him. Not a gentle thing, not a farewell. It was a forging. They left before dawn, just the two of them. Jonas watched them fade down the trail, Elijah tall beside her now, no longer a shadow but a blade sharpened by years of waiting. Mary's stride had not slowed. The world still had debts it owed her. He returned to the cabin, built a second bench beside the first. He waited through winter, then spring, planting no garden this time. He carved their names, Mary, Elijah, into the beam above the door. By the next year, a woman rode up the hill. She was young, shoulders hunched, wrists marked by rope. She asked if the rumors were true, about the cabin, about the woman who'd burned the brothel in Darwin, the one who killed pimps in the hills with her son like a wolf at her side. Jonas said nothing, just pointed to the basin where she could wash. She stayed the night, then another. More girls came in the months that followed. Some limped, some carried children. One came with frostbite, two with black eyes. They said nothing of what they'd fled. Jonas didn't ask. He built bunks. The old lean-to became a second shelter. Food was split, wood was shared. They called it the Bone Widow's Refuge. Sometimes Elijah returned briefly, older each time. He brought herbs, tools, traps he'd learned to build. He asked about the wounded women. He looked for his mother's name on their lips. And Mary, she did not come back, not in person. But her name moved with the wind through border towns and deep woods, whispered in mines, rail lines, markets where girls stood silent beside wagons. They said she left bones behind like messages. That her son didn't speak, only watched, then judged. That the mother taught him to listen, and the father who raised him taught him to wait. And that when he came for you, it meant the world had already passed sentence. Jonas died before the seventh snow. They buried him beside the first tree Mary cut. Elijah returned that night, lit a fire, and sat on the bench alone. When the flames died down, he whispered, "We still remember." And far away, in a place without name, Mary carved another line into her ledger. Then she crossed it out, not with ink, with blood, because justice does not sleep. It rides on silent boots, raised by hands once sold like cattle, tempered by a mother's pain and a lumberjack's mercy. And when the world forgets what it owes, the fire returns. Every time.